Hey everybody, how are you doing? Good. I'm Jillian, and I'm your MC today. So how's everyone feeling today? You guys mind blown from virtual reality or food coma? I don't know. So we have some great sessions today. How many of you guys are mobile app developers? Raise your hands, a little cheering, a little whoop, whoop, whoop. Okay, we could do a little better. Anyway, we have a great, exciting session for you today. Eddie and Ming are kicking us off with great experiences for app links and mobile app architecture. Without further ado, here is Eddie.
Thanks, Jillian. So my name's Eddie O'Neill. I'm a product manager on the Facebook platform team, and I'm here with Ming Lee, who will be up in a little bit. I'm basically just doing a long intro for Ming. We're here to talk about app links. We could have shortened the title of this talk down to something that probably would have been a little bit more like design patterns for app links. What we're here today to kind of walk through is what the last year has been like for us as we, because we announced app links at F8. How many people were at F8 last year? F8 2014? Awesome. We're here to talk through what we've learned in the last year from partners, some metrics and like what adoption looks like for us, and a bunch of things that we have found as we've gone through the last year and talked to everybody at some of the events that we've had, talked to developers that are using app links. And what has kind of come out of that are a bunch of design patterns that we think are interesting to sort of talk through as we all think about taking two apps on mobile and having them link to each other. And so it all starts with the URL. If you saw Ilya in the keynote last year, I think he used a superlative like beautiful when he referred to the URL. And I don't tend to think of the URL necessarily as beautiful, but it's certainly extremely useful. And I've been dealing with URLs for the past, it's hard to say this, but 20 years. And they're largely unchanged. You could take this URL and you can copy and paste it and send it in an email. You can send it in an SMS. You can post it to Facebook. You can post it to Twitter. You can send it in a message. I could write it down on a piece of paper and send it via carrier pigeon or bury it in the ground and dig it up in 5 years and type it into an address bar in a browser, and it's more than likely going to work. So URLs are really great permanent identifiers for content on the internet. And if we rewind and think about things in the way that the web works, URLs work great today on the web, but that wasn't always the case. And so back in the day, it used to be the case that when you had a link on a Windows machine and you wanted to pick it up and send it to somebody on a Mac, or you had a link in Internet Explorer and you wanted to pick it up and send it to a friend that used Mozilla or Firefox, it didn't always work. So you pick the link up, you send it over the wire, and your friend would get the link and they'd click on it and nothing would happen. They wouldn't have the plugin. They wouldn't have the browser helper object. They wouldn't have something in their environment, on their operating system or in their browser that would make the link go. And so people long ago used to kind of have this hesitancy around picking links up and sending them around because they didn't know what was going to happen. And so they'd send them and then they'd have these crazy conversations with their friends about how the links wouldn't open. In the last 15 years, we've largely fixed this problem. I don't anymore, and I doubt that any of you think about picking links up and sending them in an email. You worry about that. You just assume it's going to work. And we've done a really good job as a community making this work on the desktop. But it still doesn't work very well on mobile. And so we have these amazing experiences that exist in apps, and we all carry around these tiny little pieces of hardware that we could barely imagine 20 years ago that do things like they have motion sensors, they have gyroscopes in them. They know whether I'm walking, whether I'm running, whether I'm on a bike, whether I'm in a car, I'm in an airplane, based on how fast I'm moving. They have GPS sensors. They know where I am. They have cameras. We have HD video cameras that we carry around with us. It's just it's amazing. And what happens is we use those content creation tools in these apps to build to create these amazing app experiences. And so this screenshot on the left is a run I did in Whistler, British Columbia last year. And when I was even taking this screenshot just for this talk, it was great to go back and look at this run and think about that experience. And the screenshot on the right comes from Swarm, which is Foursquare's check-in app. And it was from a colleague of ours, Eliza. And Eliza was in Mission Dolores Park over the weekend, and this is a screenshot of that. And I can go into the app and I can look at where she was, who she was with, what photos she took, and so on and so on. And I get these great experiences in apps. A lot of this content ends up being locked up inside the app. So, most of us build apps assuming that the way that people are going to get to content is, they pick up their phone, they unlock it, they press the home button, they scroll around and they find the app, they tap on the app pops up, and then they go, root through the app looking for content. And in general, it's hard to take apps and have software open them. So most of us don't tend to think about our apps as platforms. And so what we're going to talk about today are some patterns for taking your apps and turning them into platforms. And one of the ways that we think we can help the community make that happen is app links. So app links are this open cross-platform way to basically make URLs work everywhere. And the way this works is like this. Sorry, we're missing a slide. Hopefully we don't have any other surprises as we go through the rest of this. The way this works is that link that we had at the beginning, we take that link that works on the web. And app links go and add a set of meta tags to that link that basically help software understand that if they have that link on a mobile device, that they can, where you would go find that content inside an iOS app or inside an Android app. And all of that lives underneath that root URL. And app links, because it kind of creates this association between that canonical URL and a destination in iOS and a destination in Android, enables two things. The first of those things is it helps sources of traffic like Facebook or Messenger or search engines. It helps those sources of traffic kind of figure out, given a URL and given a particular device environment. I might be on an iPhone or an iPad. I might be on a Nexus phone. I might be on a Windows phone. It helps all of those environments kind of decide what to do. They can take that URL and they can figure out if they're going to go open that content inside an app. And we're not here to talk about that half of this today. What we're here to talk about is what happens next. And so it's this experience where I'm sitting in the Facebook app and Facebook is about to drive traffic to Swarm. Because I see this same story from Eliza and I tap on it. And now I switch over into the Swarm app. I see this piece of content, I consume it, I scroll through the photos. And then I can go back to the Facebook app by clicking either the software back button in the operating system down in the bottom left or Swarm's back button in the top left. And so what we're talking about today are a bunch of patterns for how to handle these kinds of incoming links into your apps. So with all of that as kind of preamble for why we're going to talk about design patterns, let's talk a little bit about what's happened in the last year. So in the last year, we've seen a bunch of great adoption. How many people work on apps that have adopted app links? A handful? OK, that's awesome. More than 1,000 apps have adopted app links, and more than 7 billion pages, mostly on the web, more than 7 billion pages have been marked up with content so that given a canonical URL, underneath that URL is where to find that content on iOS and where to find that content on Android. So there's 7 billion pieces of content where you, if you have one of those links, you can go look at that web page through our SDKs, bring down a little bit of information that say, hey, I, as the developer of this app, can decide where to send this traffic. And so there are a bunch of apps, more than 1,000, that can then receive and handle that traffic. But a really interesting thing happened for us in August last year. We had an event in San Francisco where we kind of announced some new features. And one of those features was what we called App Link Analytics. And in the same way that you have web servers, and you probably count referral traffic, so where does traffic come from to your website, and where are people going once they land on the website, we added a set of hooks into the SDKs that made it really easy to kind of count inbound links that were coming into your app via app links. But one of our engineers, Jason, where's Jason? One of our engineers, Jason, was having a conversation with a developer at that event and was sitting down and talking about taking their entire app and thinking about every view and every activity in the app as something that would have a URL associated with it. And the developer, and I don't know if that developer's in the room. If you are, I'd love to talk to you. That developer had thought a lot about their app as being something that people opened from the home screen and navigated around that way. And occasionally Facebook linked to their app for various things. But that developer, as Jason's having this conversation about taking every view and associating a link with every view, literally says to us, no one has ever made me think about mobile apps like that before. You just blew my mind. And what we realized was that we needed to kind of change the way we were talking about app links with the community and have a conversation sort of at a lower level about app architecture and app design. And so let's go back and talk about an analogy. So back in the web, who built web apps? I built a bunch of web apps. Everybody should have their hands up. I assume everybody built a web app at some point. If you think about the way that we built web apps, we had all of these web frameworks and we had all these development tools, things like Visual Studio, things like IntelliJ, things like Coda, and all these other tools that had file menus. And so you would go File, New, and you would pick HTML file, XHTML file, JSP file, PHP file, ASP file, and you drop some file on disk somewhere. And that file's URL addressable. When we were building web apps, every single file that we created that had markup in it was something that was addressable with a URL. And we didn't really spend a lot of time thinking about what those URLs look like. We thought about it when we were naming the file and naming the directory the file would live in. And all of a sudden, we've got addressable content. And so we were able to take all of these frameworks and enable that amazing experience on desktop that we're so familiar with, where you can pick a link up and drop it anywhere, and somebody's going to be able to dereference it. And we don't have an equivalent of that on mobile today. So on mobile, we have to be a little bit more careful and do a little bit more thinking in upfront design, where we're going to sit down and kind of enable these experiences where your apps can be linked to from other apps. So we have to use a little bit more thought. We don't, for example, have an equivalent of routes.rb, so the Ruby dispatch file that lets you map an incoming URL to a block of code or a template. So let's take a look at the 4 patterns we're going to walk through. So the first pattern is something called addressable content. All 4 of these apps, so Strava has riding a bike and running activity. Rdio has artists and songs and playlists. BuzzFeed has content from journalists. And Swarm has check-ins. And so all of these things are content that people are creating inside these awesome apps that are enabled through all these sensors on the phone. And so you want to be able to open apps to this kind of content. We also have a set of what we think of as addressable activities. And so these are things that tend to be more sort of static things in your app that are common between everybody that uses your app, but they're probably a view, probably an activity, something like that. And so we'll walk through 3 examples here. The first is this camera. So let's say you're building a camera. You're building a camera app, and you're sitting at coffee one day with some developer friends that are building another app, and they're like, hey, I love your camera. I really want to be able, from my app, to open your camera directly so people can take a photo, and then come back with that photo and do something in this other app over here. And so you have this conversation about how to make that work, and that's a link to an activity. It's a camera activity. Let's say you're an e-commerce company, and so you're a retailer. You sell apparel. And you have a sale every season to kind of clear out your shoes. And so you build an activity, you build a view inside your app for a shoe sale. And so people can pop your app open, and when they pop your app open, they see this interstitial. And this interstitial, it says when the sale starts, when the sale ends, what percentage of discount you're going to get, and then lets you go into the app and buy shoes. And that works great for people that are going to kind of naturally visit your app from the home screen. But let's say you then want to take that sale and you want to advertise it on Facebook. The easiest way to do that is to build an app link and use a URL, an HTTP URL that points at that sale page. And then what you can do is you can write that URL down on a piece of paper, tie it to a carrier pigeon, and have the carrier pigeon fly down the hall to the marketing manager. And your marketing manager can take that URL, unroll it, type it into Facebook's ads tools, and now for people who have the app installed, you can run ads. And those people will see that ad, they can click on that ad, go into the fall sale page, and now you've got the fall sale page there. If you don't have the app, great, you've still got a web URL, that root URL we were talking about. And now people can click on that and they can go see content on the mobile web. And the way that that's enabled is by thinking up front about how the app's designed, how URLs associated with all those views, and it kind of creates this sort of option value for you in the future to be able to use those URLs for something meaningful. And then the third scenario is related to a product that we announced yesterday in a set of blog posts on the developers blog that we're going to talk about, I believe, in this room right after this session, called App Invites. And App Invites is a sharing product, and it lets you build these, invite your friends to try this app experiences, because so much, of app discovery is word of mouth. But what App Invites does is once I've received an invite and I say, yes, I want to accept this invite from Eugene, and I want to go try this amazing app, and I click in the Facebook app and I go over to this app, the way that transition happens is through an app link. And so now I land in this app and I can log in or create an account or learn more or whatever. But that transition is an app link. And so here you've got an example of places where as we do more things to open apps over the next few years, we're gonna do those things with app links. And so if you have those views and those activities in your apps exposed as URLs, you now enable these amazing experiences in the future. Two other quick patterns. One, handling custom parameters. I don't think we need to talk a lot about why parameters are valuable. They help parameterize URLs. And so we want to talk about how you would use custom parameters and app links to do interesting things. And four, fallback handling. And the question marks are intentional here, unlike the slide bug earlier. The question marks are intentional here. So you might have content inside your app that you just haven't built into native yet, and you still want to open on the web. And this fallback handling is a way to use app links, is a pattern for using app links to then pop open content that might be shown in a UI web view inside your app. And so with that kind of long preamble, Ming's going to actually come up and talk about the technical details of how you would go through and implement all of these patterns, what that looks like in code, what that looks like in markup that might go in a web page. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Ming.
Thanks, Eddie. I hope that by now Eddie has convinced all of you why building addressable apps is very important and why we're using URLs as a basis for sharing. So let's talk about how you make your apps actually addressable. Well, you need to do two things. You need to publish URLs, and you need to be able to handle traffic. Now, even though I have to talk about these in a certain order, I must emphasize that you need to be able to do both of these together. It doesn't make sense to publish URLs and have your friends share them or have your users share them if your app can't handle incoming URLs. And it doesn't make sense to build handling of URLs in your app if you don't publish them to be shared. So first we'll talk about how to publish URLs. As mentioned previously, we use URLs because it's just universally understandable. People who have been using the web for the past 20 years have grown up essentially with URLs. And so it's easy to copy and paste and share with other people via many different channels like Facebook or email. In fact, all the web-ish ways that apply to URLs still apply in the mobile world if you use app links and if your apps support app links. The sharing, display, and interaction paradigms are all exactly the same. So once you have a URL with app links metadata in it, what does it mean? What happens to that URL? So let's go over a quick primer of the app links protocol. The app links protocol has two parts: discovery and navigation. Discovery is how other apps figure out how to actually link into your app. It's typically done by going to the actual URL, parsing the HTML page for the appropriate meta tags. Navigation is how an outlinking app opens your app to the right place, so it actually shows the right content. The specifics here are going to be platform dependent, and I'll talk a little bit about each platform. So for discovery, we always start with a canonical URL, an HTTP URL that's addressable from the web. And if you have an iOS app, what you do is you add a meta tag that tells us how to open your iOS app to the right place. So this is where the handling of URLs comes into play, because your app needs to be able to handle that URL and open it to the right place. On Android, it's very similar. You can also tell us a custom URL that will open your app, and you also tell us the package name, and we use the package name to figure out the right app to open. There's also a couple of optional fields, like the app name, which shows a displayable name for your app, and App Store ID, which allows for a potential channel for installs on iOS. On Android, we just use the package name that you tell us as the index into the Google Play Store. Now, you might ask, what if you're a mobile-only app? What if you have no web presence or very little web presence, and it's very hard for you to go and change the HTML pages? Well, we have two solutions for that. You can use the Facebook hosting API, and what that allows you to do is tell us your deep linking metadata, and we will give you a HTTP URL for you to share. Or you can use parse. Parse has cloud code, which allows people to easily create static HTML pages. And there is a app links module that you can basically plug into cloud code that allows you to add app links metadata into your pages. So now that we've covered discovery, how does navigation work? On iOS, we always start with the canonical URL, the web addressable URL. So we go to that URL, and we will look for any iOS-specific tags. In this case, it's shoes:/sneaker. And we take that custom or native URL, and we'll call open URL to open your app. So in this case, it'll show a shoe. Again, this is where the handling aspect of it comes in, that you actually need to show the right content. And we'll cover that in a little bit. So again, we call open URL with that custom URL, and we'll also add a query parameter onto it called AL app link data. This allows us to add a payload and pass in some extra metadata. So what does AL app link data look like? It's a JSON encoded string that includes the target URL, which is the original HTTP URL that was shared. It includes the referrer app link, which tells you a little bit about the app just linked to you. And it has an extras map, which is just can be used to attach arbitrary metadata. On Android, the flow is very similar. Again, we start with the canonical URL, and we look for Android-specific tags, and use that to create an intent, and we call start activity with that intent. We use the custom URL in the data field of the intent, so if you develop for Android, this should be very familiar to you. And in the extras bundle, that's where we put the AL app link data. Here, we don't attach it to the native URL because Android gives you a way to attach extra payload. Again, the AL app link data contains the target URL, the original canonical URL that was shared, a referrer app link, and an extras bundle for other arbitrary data. So now that we've covered discovery and navigation, let's see how we can actually handle traffic in our apps. Fundamentally, your app needs to be able to take an incoming URL, and you need to unpack it to build a data model from it, and then use that data model to show the right content. In the following slides, we'll revisit the patterns that Eddie just talked about, and I'll also throw in some iOS code to show you how to actually do it in code. The Android code should be very similar, but for time reasons, we're only showing iOS today. So the first pattern is handling addressable content. So let's say you have a shoe store, and you want, and now you've built an iOS app, and you want to be able to show your entire catalog of shoes in your app. Well, you probably have a view controller that handles showing the detail page. And you can use unique identifiers to go to your database, load the data model, and show it in your view controller. So here we use a one-to-one relationship between the canonical URL, the HTTP URL, and the native URL. So let's see how that happens. Your sneaker goes to shoes:/sneaker, and boot, another type of shoe, might go to shoes:/boot. And in code, what happens is this is application open URL. It's a standard method in the iOS app lifecycle in the UI application delegate class. It basically gets called anytime your app is opened by a custom URL. So in here, you get the URL passed to you, and you just use standard Objective-C URL parsing mechanisms to parse the URL, grab the path from it, and then use that path as the unique identifier for your shoe. So this is basically the simplest way to show addressable content. On Android, again, it's very similar. You'll probably have an intent filter in your Android manifest that goes to an activity, and that activity will have a lifecycle, and in the onCreate method, you will unpack the URL and build the right view controller for that in there. In the second pattern, we look at handling activities. So in this case, let's say you have a banking app, and you have two main features that you want to be able to link to. One is an account view, and one is a check caching view. So over here, now you probably have two different view controllers, right? One for viewing the account and one for caching checks. And instead of the previous pattern where you only had one that showed the detail page for the view. So here we can still use a one-to-one mapping between canonical URLs and custom URLs. So account goes to account, and your cache check goes to the bank cache check. But the code to handle it, we have to now figure out the right view controller to load based on the incoming path. So again, in the application OpenURL method, we look at the path component by parsing it using standard Objective-C parsing mechanisms. And then we look at the path. So here is where we demux based on the path. And if it's account, we show the account view controller. And if it's check caching, we show the check caching view controller. Again, pretty straightforward. For the third pattern, we'll talk about how to handle custom parameters. So this is actually where the power of app links shines. Let's say you are using our App Invites product, which we're going to talk about in the following session. And in order to attract customers, you want to dynamically generate a coupon code for all your potential new customers. Instead of generating a custom parameter in your native URL as well, what we can actually do is just inspect the canonical URL and parse its query parameters. This is what we like to call the routing model, where like the native URL is only used to open your app, and you actually look at the original shared URL to load the data model. So let's see how that works. So here we use BFURL. BFURL comes from Bolt's framework. It's a very lightweight open source SDK that contains a reference implementation of app links. And we hand the incoming URL over to Bolt's framework, which parses it for you and turns it into a structured data type. And we'll grab the target URL from it. Now, if you remember from earlier slides, the target URL is the original canonical URL that was shared. So in this case, we can parse the target URL for its query parameters and grab the coupon code from there. Now, I mentioned earlier this is where the power of app links shines in. Other deep linking types, or other types of deep linking, doesn't give you the original HTTP URL back. But app links will. It will give you the canonical URL that you use for your website or for your Android app or for your iOS app together in your native app. Here I'm parsing it using a class that we have in the Facebook SDK for iOS, but you can easily parse the query string yourself using standard Objective-C methods. For the fourth pattern, we'll talk about handling fallback. So in this case, you may have content on your website that you don't have a view controller for in your native app. For example, the copyright page. No one's going to go and build a view controller specific for your native app just to show the copyright page. Another example might be the help page, right? But you still want to be able to show them in your native app for a complete experience. And you probably want to be able to link to them. So how do you do that? Well, you can specify a fallback handler, so both copyright and help go to the fallback handler, and the fallback handler essentially just takes the canonical URL and shows it in a web view. So here's how to do that. So if your path component is fallback, we'll parse the incoming URL, again, using Bolt's framework, and grab the target URL from it, and then you just show it in an embedded web view. Now you can show everything from your website in your native app. Cool. So we just covered 4 major patterns, but I do want to mention that in order to provide a consistent experience, apps should provide a way back to the app that just opened them, right? I've used a lot of apps on iOS that have like ad hoc linking mechanisms, and I click on something in one app, it opens another app, but now I have no way to go back to the previous app. So what if I were using a to-do app to manage my to-do list, right? And now I'm cashing my check. I go over to my bank app. I'm done cashing my check. How do I go back to my to-do list? Right now on iOS, you have to do like 2 button presses, a swipe, and another press. But if you could just have a back button or a banner to go back to the previous app, now I can complete the experience. Similarly, on Android, a lot of apps will actually intercept the back button and show a home screen or something like that. But instead, you should just let the OS handle back for you, where it'll naturally go back to the previous app. So just to recap, now that you want to implement app links, what do? First, you should add meta tags to your HTML to indicate which platforms you have native apps on, right? If you don't have a website or if you have very limited web presence, you can use the App Links hosting API or the parse cloud code module to get a shareable URL. And then finally, in your client application, you should use Bolt's framework to parse incoming URLs and build data models from them. Bolt's framework will also allow you to do outlinking. So what if you have an app and you want to link to other apps? Bolt's framework will take a HTTP URL, and it will go out, parse the HTML, figure out the right meta tags, and actually do the linking for you. You can also use the Facebook Index API, where you pass us a URL, and we'll give you back structured data for performance and reliability reasons, because we will do the fetching of the HTML and parsing for you and return you structured data. So if you need more information, please go to applinks.org. Because we started a little bit late today, we won't have time for a Q&A session, but we do have a booth in the Dev Garage, so if you have any questions, please visit us in the Dev Garage. And yeah, thank you.